When Zohan Mamdani returned to New York City after college, he came back with a deep sense of purpose. He had studied economics and Africana studies, but more than anything, he had studied people, how power shapes lives, and how communities survive despite the odds. For him, knowledge without service was empty. He wanted to serve where he had grown up, among working-class New Yorkers, immigrants, and tenants trying to make ends meet in Queens. The early years of his career were not spent in offices of privilege, but in the living rooms of families facing eviction notices, in crowded apartment buildings, and in community centers filled with anxious tenants. He began working as a housing counselor, a job that placed him directly in the heart of one of New York's most urgent crises, the fight for affordable housing. A city of contradictions. New York City has long been a place of contradictions, a city of billionaires and the unhoused, of glass towers and crumbling tenements. Rent laws are complex, and gentrification has transformed neighborhoods that once welcomed working families into playgrounds for the wealthy. In Queens, one of the most diverse areas of the world, the cost of living was rising faster than wages. Zohan saw it all firsthand. Day after day, he met people who had done everything right. They worked hard, paid taxes, and tried to build a future, yet still found themselves on the edge of losing their homes. He met immigrants who feared that complaining to a landlord could cost them not only their apartment, but also their dignity. To him, these were not isolated cases. They were symptoms of a system that favored profit over people. He often said in interviews and speeches that housing should be treated as a human right, not a luxury commodity. Learning from the ground up. As a housing counselor, Zohan's role was both bureaucratic and human. He had to navigate New York's complex web of tenant protection laws, landlord regulations, and rent court procedures. But he also had to comfort parents crying over eviction notices, and reassure seniors terrified of losing their lifelong homes. He helped families apply for rental assistance, challenged unlawful rent increases, and guided tenants through housing court. In doing so, he witnessed how many laws that were meant to protect people were written in ways that made them almost unusable for the very tenants who needed them most. This experience shaped his political philosophy. He realized that the fight for housing justice wasn't just about better laws. It was about changing who wrote those laws in the first place, from counselor to organizer. Beyond his day job, Zohan became an active presence in the community. He joined local tenant associations, supported rent strikes, and attended neighborhood meetings. He listened more than he spoke, always asking people what they needed, rather than telling them what to do. He worked closely with community-based organizations that fought against illegal evictions and for stronger rent control protections. Through these collaborations, he became part of a growing movement in New York, one that saw housing not as an individual issue, but as a collective struggle. He also began to see the links between housing and other forms of inequality, racial segregation, income disparity, and climate change. He understood that when low-income tenants are pushed out of neighborhoods, they are often forced into areas with fewer schools, less public transit, and higher environmental risks. Housing, he came to believe, was the foundation upon which every other right, education, safety, and opportunity was built. A new kind of leadership. By the late 2010s, frustration with New York's political establishment was growing. Rents were rising faster than ever, homelessness was increasing, and corporate developers had immense influence at City Hall. Many people in Queens felt that their representatives had stopped listening to them. In 2019, when Zohan decided to run for the New York State Assembly, his campaign emerged directly from his housing work. His experience on the ground gave him authenticity that few politicians had. He wasn't running as a career politician. He was running as someone who had walked the same streets, knocked on the same doors, and felt the same fears as the people he hoped to represent. His platform centered around housing justice, expanding rent stabilization, ending homelessness through supportive housing, taxing vacant luxury apartments, and making it easier for tenants to organize without fear of retaliation. He often told residents, "Housing is not a privilege for the wealthy. It's a basic human need. And if our laws don't recognize that, then we must change the laws." Activism during crisis. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck New York City in early 2020, housing insecurity exploded. Thousands of tenants lost their jobs overnight and couldn't pay rent. Eviction moratoriums were uncertain, and food insecurity spread rapidly. While many campaigns went quiet during the pandemic, Zohan and his volunteers turned theirs into a mutual aid network. They organized food deliveries, raised money for rent relief, and coordinated phone banks to connect struggling tenants with legal resources. He spent his days on the phone and his nights dropping off groceries, wearing a mask and gloves, speaking through apartment doors. To him, this wasn't politics, it was service. This period defined his public image. The people of Queens began to see him not just as a candidate, but as a neighbor who showed up when others stayed home. His actions reflected his core belief that government should meet people's most basic needs before anything else. In the Assembly, turning activism into action. When Zohan Mamdani was elected to the New York State Assembly in 2020, he brought the same passion for housing justice to Albany. He joined the Housing Committee and began advocating for stronger rent protections and public investment in housing. One of his key initiatives was pushing for good cause eviction legislation, a bill that would prevent landlords from evicting tenants without legitimate reason and would cap excessive rent hikes. He argued that this law would give tenants the basic security to live without constant fear of losing their homes. He also supported policies for public ownership of utilities, arguing that energy and housing should both be treated as essential public goods. his activism expanded into transit and environmental justice. But at its core, it remained rooted in the belief that people deserve stability and dignity. Connecting struggles across communities. Zohan's activism is notable for how it bridges communities that are often divided by race, class, and immigration status. In Queens, where over half the residents are foreign-born, he consistently works to ensure that tenants' rights are accessible in multiple languages, and that immigrant families are protected regardless of documentation status. He believes that housing justice is inseparable from racial justice, pointing out how redlining, gentrification, and displacement have long targeted Black and brown communities. His speeches often emphasize solidarity among tenants. Regardless of background, he once remarked in an interview, "When you look at who's being evicted, who's being displaced, who's being ignored, it's the same story written in different languages. The solution begins when we start reading it together." Legacy and continuing work. Today, Zohan Mamdani continues to champion housing reform in New York. He is part of a broader generation of progressive lawmakers who see housing not just as an issue to fix, but as a movement to build. His work has inspired younger activists to enter local politics and to see community organizing as a powerful form of leadership. He has shown that political power can grow from compassion and that empathy can be a tool for transformation. Though his career continues to evolve, one thing remains constant: his belief that every person deserves a safe, stable, and affordable home. From his early days as a housing counselor to his current role as a legislator, his activism reflects a deep truth. When people fight for their homes, they are fighting for their humanity. When Zohan Mamdani entered the New York State Assembly in January 2021, he brought with him not the language of career politicians, but the conviction and urgency of a community organizer. To many in Albany, he was a new and unfamiliar figure, young, outspoken, and unapologetically progressive. To his supporters in Queens, however, he was their voice inside the halls of power. From the very beginning, Zohan made it clear that his mission was to bring the struggles of tenants, workers, and immigrants into legislative focus. His goal was not just to fix problems temporarily, but to transform the systems that created them. Championing good cause eviction, one of the first major policies he supported was the Good Cause Eviction Bill, a landmark piece of legislation designed to protect tenants across New York State. For decades, tenants in unregulated apartments could be evicted for virtually any reason, or none at all. Landlords could raise rents dramatically, forcing families out of their homes. Zohan saw this as a moral failure of government. He argued that people should not live in fear of losing their homes simply because their landlord wanted more profit. The Good Cause Eviction proposal sought to change that by guaranteeing that tenants could only be evicted for legitimate reasons, such as failure to pay rent or damage to property, and by limiting excessive rent hikes to a reasonable percentage each year. For months, he fought tirelessly to build support for the bill. He spoke at rallies, met with housing advocates, and joined protests on the steps of the Capitol. In speeches, he reminded lawmakers that housing was not a commodity to be traded, but a right to be protected. Although the legislation faced heavy opposition from real estate interests and conservative lawmakers, Zohan's persistence helped move the conversation into the mainstream. By 2023, the idea of good cause eviction had gone from a fringe proposal to a central demand of New York's progressive movement / public power and utility justice. Zohan's housing activism naturally extended to other basic needs, especially utilities and energy. In Astoria, he had seen families struggling to pay their heating bills, even while corporate energy companies made record profits. He began advocating for public ownership of utilities, a movement known as Public Power NY. The campaign aimed to bring electricity and heating under public control, ensuring that energy was provided affordably and sustainably, rather than for corporate gain. Zohan co-sponsored legislation to create publicly accountable power authorities and supported a transition to renewable energy sources, especially in neighborhoods disproportionately affected by pollution and environmental neglect. For him, housing justice and energy justice were two sides of the same coin. Both were about giving people control over the essentials of life. Defending tenants during crisis. Even after the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, New York's housing crisis deepened. Many tenants were still behind on rent, and eviction courts were overwhelmed. Zohan worked with tenant unions and mutual aid groups to ensure that the state's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP, reached those most in need, particularly immigrants and undocumented residents who were often excluded from relief programs. He also pushed for expanded legal representation for tenants in housing court, arguing that landlords almost always had lawyers, while most tenants faced eviction alone. He helped secure funding for programs that provided free legal aid, ensuring that tenants could defend their rights in court. His advocacy wasn't confined to the legislative chamber. He continued to attend rallies in his district, to visit tenants facing eviction, and to bring their stories to Albany. Reporters often noted that he blended the roles of activist and lawmaker seamlessly, treating his office not as a seat of authority, but as a platform for collective action, building coalitions across movements. Zohan's approach to policymaking was shaped by the belief that no struggle stands alone. He worked closely with fellow progressive legislators like Farah Forrest, Jabari Brisport, and Julia Salazar, forming a coalition of lawmakers, sometimes referred to as the Socialist Caucus. Together, they pushed for bills on affordable housing, climate action, labor rights, and police accountability. Their shared vision was a New York where basic needs, housing, healthcare, transit, and energy, were not luxuries, but rights. Zohan's speeches in the Assembly often referenced both global justice movements and the experiences of his neighbors in Queens. He drew on lessons from immigrant solidarity, anti-colonial history, and local tenant struggles. For him, the fight for housing justice was connected to a broader global fight against exploitation. Community first, the Astoria model. Back home in Astoria, Zohan's office became a center of community engagement. Unlike traditional political offices that focused mainly on constituent paperwork, his team organized educational workshops on tenant rights, housing court procedures, and rent stabilization laws. They created multilingual materials in Spanish, Bengali, Arabic, Urdu, and Greek to reach every group in the district. His staff reflected the same diversity as the community itself, allowing constituents to feel represented in both language and experience. He also continued to support mutual aid initiatives, partnering with local nonprofits to distribute food, hygiene products, and rent relief information. These efforts blurred the line between activism and governance, and that was exactly how Zohan wanted it. He once said in a town hall meeting, "The work of government is not just to pass laws. It's to stand beside people in their struggles until those laws actually mean something in their lives." Confronting opposition and staying grounded. Of course, his progressive approach faced strong opposition. Real estate lobbies, centrist politicians, and conservative media outlets often criticized his policies as unrealistic or too radical. But Zohan remained steadfast. When questioned about his socialist values, he responded calmly that his ideas were not extreme. Homelessness, displacement, and poverty were extreme. He reminded critics that public housing, social security, and labor rights were all once dismissed as radical too. Even under pressure, he refused corporate donations and continued to fund his campaigns through small, grassroots contributions. This allowed him to stay accountable to the people who elected him, not to special interests. Legacy of empowerment. Through his years in the assembly, Zohan Mamdani redefined what it meant to be a public servant. He showed that politics could be deeply human, that a legislator could both write laws and deliver groceries, both debate policy and sit with a tenant facing eviction. His legislative victories, while gradual, created a long-lasting shift in New York politics. Issues that were once ignored, rent control expansion, utility ownership, housing as a right, became central topics of statewide debate. Perhaps his greatest impact, however, has been inspiration to countless young activists. His story is proof that grassroots organizing can lead to real power. He built bridges between generations, between renters and homeowners, between immigrants and native-born citizens, all under a shared vision of justice and dignity. The road ahead. As Zohan's political journey continues, from assembly member to potential citywide leader, his foundation remains the same: service to his community. Whether he is advocating for public housing reform, pushing for tenant protections, or working to make New York City affordable for future generations, his guiding principle endures. We are not here to manage injustice. We are here to end it. For Zohan Mamdani, housing activism is not just a chapter of his biography. It is the thread that weaves through his entire life. From his earliest work as a counselor in Queens to his place in the Assembly, his fight for housing justice reflects a simple but revolutionary belief. Everyone deserves a home, and no one should live in fear of losing it. Launching the mayoral campaign. When Zohan Mamdani announced his run for New York City mayor in October 2024, he carried with him the identity and momentum built through years of housing and tenant activism. His campaign platform echoed the very values he had fought for at the neighborhood level: affordability, tenants' rights, public utilities, and community power. His promises included a rent freeze on rent-stabilized units, free bus service across the city, city-run grocery stores to lower food costs, construction of hundreds of thousands of truly affordable units, funding these with taxes on top earners and corporations. Following his earlier experience helping tenants and organizing at the local level, translated into a network of volunteers, multilingual outreach, and an inclusive campaign structure. He also used digital tools, social media, memes, and multilingual messaging to reach communities often overlooked by mainstream campaigns: renters, immigrants, working families. By doing so, he transformed the local activism mindset into a citywide movement. The very same energy that helped tenants fight evictions now helped a candidate challenge the political establishment. Facing resistance, staying grounded. As his campaign gained traction, opposition grew. Critics questioned whether someone with his activist background could manage the enormous responsibilities of New York City governance. They pointed to the complexity of city budgets, the power of real estate interests, and the institutional inertia that tends to resist radical change. Mamdani responded by reminding people of what local activism had taught him: listening, coalition building, being accountable to communities rather than special interests. His message: if you want a city where working people can thrive, then you need leadership that has been with them, not above them. Legacy and what comes next. When Mamdani's mayoral campaign successfully harnessed the values of his housing and community activism, it created a precedent. Housing justice is not just a policy niche. It can be the platform for citywide transformation. His journey from tenant advocate to mayoral contender and eventual winner shows that the same principles that work on a block in Queens can scale to an entire city. If he holds office, his next chapter will test whether the ideas born on the ground, rent protections, public power, community-centered governance, can be institutionalized at city scale. His success will depend on bridging grassroots energy with the machinery of government. A historic victory. On November 4th, 2025, Zohan Mamdani made history by being elected as the first Muslim and South Asian mayor of New York City. His victory marked more than just a political milestone. It represented a cultural and generational shift in New York's identity. A son of immigrants, a housing counselor, and a former assembly member, Mamdani's rise to City Hall embodied the city's own story, a mosaic of struggle, resilience, and hope. His campaign slogan, "A New York for All of Us," was more than rhetoric. It reflected years of grassroots work among renters, workers, and families who had long felt ignored by the city's elite. In his victory speech in Astoria Park, he stood before a crowd of thousands, many holding homemade banners in different languages, and said, "This city taught me everything I know: how to fight, how to care, and how to dream. And now it's time to make New York live up to its promise, that every single person, no matter where they come from or how much they earn, deserves a home." The applause that followed symbolized not only joy, but a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in decades, many New Yorkers felt that City Hall truly belonged to them. The transition, bringing activism inside government. Even before taking office, Mamdani signaled that his administration would be different. His transition team was made up not of corporate advisors or lobbyists, but of community leaders, union organizers, tenant representatives, and small business owners. He said he wanted to build a government that looks like the neighborhoods it serves. He appointed housing justice advocates to key city departments, including the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, and the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. For the first time, many of these agencies were led by people who had once stood outside government buildings, protesting their policies. He also launched the People's Transition Forums, a series of public listening sessions across all 5 boroughs. These gatherings allowed residents to directly contribute ideas to his policy agenda, from affordable housing design to public transit priorities. It was a bold experiment in participatory democracy. The housing mandate, making homes, not profits. From the start, Mayor Mamdani declared housing justice as the central mission of his administration. In his first 100 days, he introduced the Homes for All initiative, a sweeping package of reforms designed to tackle the housing crisis on multiple fronts. The city began plans to build 200,000 deeply affordable units on public land within 8 years, prioritizing low-income and working-class families. 2. City-owned housing agency. A new municipal body was established to oversee the direct construction and management of housing, reducing dependence on private developers. Permanent rent freeze. On rent-stabilized units, Mamdani issued an executive order freezing rent increases for the first 2 years of his term. Good cause eviction, city version. Building on his legislative advocacy, he signed an executive measure protecting tenants from arbitrary eviction, while urging the state to expand it statewide. Vacancy tax. He imposed new taxes on landlords who left properties vacant for speculative gain, directing the revenue into public housing maintenance and homelessness prevention. These measures drew both admiration and fierce debate. Developers and real estate lobbies warned that investment would dry up, but Mamdani countered with data. Vacancy rates were high, construction profits were rising, and homelessness remained unacceptable in a city of wealth. He said simply, "Our problem isn't that we lack housing. Our problem is that too much of it is built for profit, not for people." Reimagining community power. Alongside housing reform, Mamdani's administration sought to transform how neighborhoods interacted with city government. He introduced the Community Assembly Program, neighborhood-based councils with decision-making power over portions of the city budget. Residents could propose, debate, and vote on local projects, from park renovations to street redesigns, through digital and in-person forums. This system drew inspiration from participatory models in cities like Porto Alegre and Barcelona, but was shaped by Queen-style pragmatism. For Mamdani, this was the natural evolution of his activism, not just fighting for people's voices to be heard, but giving those voices real authority. The challenge of balance. Running New York City, a metropolis of over 8 million people, tested even the strongest ideals. The first year of Mamdani's term brought challenges: rising construction costs, landlord lawsuits against his rent policies, and budget pressures from federal funding cuts. Critics accused him of being too idealistic, of governing like an organizer rather than an executive. But his response was consistent. He listened. He met with opponents, adjusted policies when evidence demanded it, and kept his promise never to hide behind bureaucracy. He often reminded his staff of something he'd learned as a housing counselor. Every statistic is a story. Every policy is a person's life. Economic justice and urban renewal. Beyond housing, Mamdani expanded his platform into broader urban justice. He launched CityGrow, a network of city-run grocery stores in low-income areas designed to combat food insecurity and inflated prices. He partnered with unions to ensure all workers received fair wages and benefits. He also made New York the first major U.S. city to implement free bus service, prioritizing mobility for working-class commuters. This initiative reduced transit inequality and strengthened access to jobs, schools, and healthcare, reinforcing his belief that equity must touch every aspect of urban life. Global recognition and symbolism. Within months, Mamdani's leadership drew attention beyond New York. International media hailed him as part of a new wave of urban progressives, reshaping city politics around climate, housing, and social inclusion. He became a guest speaker at global urban policy conferences, where he often said, "The future of cities depends on who they are built for, people or profit." To many around the world, his story represented a rare phenomenon, a grassroots activist who not only won power, but used it without losing his principles. Legacy in motion. Even as his first term continued, the effects of his governance began to show. Eviction filings dropped to their lowest in a decade. Tenant organizing surged across boroughs. Public satisfaction with city services, especially among immigrant and working-class residents, began to rise. But perhaps the most significant shift was cultural. In communities that once saw politics as distant or corrupt, there was now a sense of ownership, that City Hall could belong to the people again. In interviews, when asked about legacy, Zohan always deflected the question. He would smile and say, "If a kid growing up in Queens can look at this city and think, I can change it, then that's enough of a legacy for me." Epilogue: The Spirit of Queens. From the crowded apartment buildings of Astoria to the steps of City Hall, Zohan Mamdani's journey has been one of continuity, the same purpose, scaled up. His biography is not a tale of power gained, but of service extended. He began as a housing counselor, helping families keep their homes. He became a legislator, writing laws to protect them, and now, as mayor, he governs with the same principle, that dignity begins at home, and justice begins in community. His life stands as a reminder that true leadership is not about commanding people, but building with them, door by door, block by block, city by city. Zohan Mamdani's story begins long before his political victories. It begins with his family's journey across continents and generations. He was born in Kampala, Uganda, to South Asian parents who were part of a global diaspora shaped by both colonial history and migration. His mother, Mira Nair, is a renowned filmmaker known for telling human stories that cross boundaries of culture and class. His father, Mahmoud Mamdani, is an influential scholar and writer whose work explores power, race, and post-colonial identity. Growing up between worlds, Zohan inherited a deep understanding of displacement, not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. He often described feeling rooted in motion, part Ugandan, part Indian, and wholly New Yorker. This layered identity shaped his politics profoundly. It gave him empathy for immigrants who struggled to belong, and for tenants who fought to stay in the only homes they had ever known. His Muslim faith also grounded him in the values of service, justice, and humility. He spoke often about how Islam's emphasis on charity and compassion influenced his understanding of public service. For him, faith was not a banner to wave, but a compass to live by. In interviews, he once said, "My parents taught me that faith isn't about asking what you deserve. It's about asking what you owe to others." That's how I see politics too. The personal side of politics. Despite his growing public role, Zohan has remained known for his approachability and warmth. Residents of Astoria often recall seeing him biking through the neighborhood, chatting with store owners, or joining block parties long after election victories. His colleagues describe him as someone who remembers names, stories, and small details, who listens deeply even when he disagrees. For him, leadership was never about charisma or power. It was about presence, being with people, not above them. He often credited his upbringing for this outlook. As the child of intellectuals and artists, he grew up surrounded by conversation about justice, history, film, and philosophy. Yet he never let theory distance him from reality. He carried those ideas into the world, into the work of helping others. Philosophy of service. Over the years, a clear philosophy has emerged in Mamdani's words and actions, one rooted in the politics of care. He believes that government should not merely manage society, but nurture it. Policies, in his view, must serve as acts of empathy, not tools of control. His core ideas can be summarized in 3 principles. 1. People over profit. Economic policy should prioritize human need above corporate interest. 2. Justice through proximity. Leaders must remain close to those they serve, constantly in dialogue with communities. 3. Hope as a political act. Change begins when people believe that the future can be different, and when leaders earn that belief through action. He once said in a speech at City College, "The world tells us that politics is about power, but the truth is, politics is about care. Who do you care for? Whose life do you choose to make easier? That's the only question that matters." This idea that empathy is strength has become central to his leadership and his legacy. Mentorship and the next generation. As mayor, Mamdani placed a strong emphasis on educating and empowering young activists. He launched the Civic Fellowship Program, which placed high school and college students from across the 5 boroughs into city departments to learn public service firsthand. He also worked with youth organizations to create tenant education workshops and leadership training programs, ensuring that the next generation of New Yorkers could not only advocate for themselves, but also organize for others. His mentoring style reflected his own journey, hands-on, accessible, and deeply personal. Many young organizers in Queens refer to him simply as Zohan, not Mayor Mamdani. To them, he is not just a politician, but a teacher and a proof of possibility, legacy, and cultural impact. Beyond policies, Zohan Mamdani's impact lies in how he changed the imagination of what leadership looks like. He made it normal for a son of immigrants, a Muslim, and a housing activist to stand at the center of power in one of the world's most complex cities, not as an exception, but as a reflection of New York's diversity. His leadership helped reframe activism as governance, showing that compassion and policy could coexist, that ideals could translate into structure, and that caring for people was not naive, but revolutionary. In cultural terms, he became an emblem of a new political generation, one that blends moral conviction with practical solutions, and community organizing with institutional change. Artists, filmmakers, and writers have since drawn inspiration from his journey, portraying him as a symbol of civic imagination. His own mother, Mira Nair, was once quoted as saying that her son's story proves that politics, when done with love, is the greatest art form of all. Reflections on the journey. In later interviews, Mamdani has often been asked what kept him grounded amid fame and pressure. His answer has always been simple: his community. He returns regularly to Astoria, visiting the same streets where he began his first campaign. Sometimes he joins his old volunteers for dinner, laughing about the early days of knocking on doors in the rain. He says he never wants to forget the sound of those first conversations, when people didn't know my name, only that I cared to listen. That humility, rare in politics, has become the enduring mark of his character. An ongoing story. Zohan Mamdani's biography is still being written. In every tenant who wins a rent case, in every student who decides to run for office, and in every immigrant family that feels seen in their mayor. He has shown that leadership need not be inherited or purchased. It can be built from trust, service, and solidarity. His life stands as a living bridge between struggle and possibility, proving that activism, when persistent and honest, can transform even the largest of systems. "My story," he once said, "is just one small chapter in the Book of New York. But if it teaches anything, it's that this city belongs to all of us, and we have the power to write it together." Conclusion. Zohan Mamdani's journey from a housing counselor in Queens to the mayor of New York City is more than a biography. It is a blueprint for a new kind of politics, one built not on ambition, but on service, not on privilege, but on empathy, not on the pursuit of power, but on the practice of care. His legacy will not be measured by buildings or budgets alone, but by something quieter and deeper, the renewed faith of ordinary people that politics can still serve humanity. Zohan Mamdani was born in Kampala, Uganda in 1991 into a family that valued education, justice, and creativity. His father, Mahmoud Mamdani, was a respected scholar and political thinker, and his mother, Mira Nair, was a world-renowned filmmaker. From his parents, Zohan learned that art and politics are both tools to tell the truth, that stories and struggles are deeply connected. When Zohan was still a child, his family moved to New York City. They settled in Queens, a borough known for its diversity, where more than 100 languages could be heard in a single neighborhood. It was here, in Astoria, that he grew up, surrounded by immigrants, workers, and families trying to build a better life. As a boy, Zohan saw the beauty and the burden of his community. He saw the joy of festivals and food from around the world. But he also saw people struggling to pay rent, mothers working multiple jobs, and children who had to translate for their parents in every official meeting. He began to understand that the American dream was not equally available to everyone. His childhood was shaped by the balance between privilege and poverty, between opportunity and inequality. His parents taught him to think critically, to ask questions, and to stand with those who are treated unfairly. That sense of justice stayed with him as he grew older. After finishing high school, Zohan attended Bowdoin College in Maine. There, he studied economics, but his education went beyond textbooks. He became deeply involved in activism and community organizing. He learned that real power does not just sit in government offices. It also lives in the hearts of ordinary people who come together to fight for what is right. When he returned to New York after graduation, Zohan wanted to serve his community directly. He began working as a housing counselor, helping tenants who were facing eviction or discrimination from landlords. Day after day, he met families who had worked for years, yet were being pushed out of their homes because rent prices kept climbing. He saw how laws and systems protected property owners more than the people who lived and worked in the city. Each story weighed heavily on him. He met single mothers, immigrants without papers, elderly tenants, all struggling to survive in a city that claimed to be full of opportunity. He tried to help through his job, but the more he saw, the more he realized that the problem was much larger than one office could solve. One evening, after a long day of helping a family who was being evicted from their apartment, Zohan sat quietly at his desk. He realized that to truly change things, he couldn't just respond to problems. He had to change the rules that created them. That moment planted the idea of running for office. At first, the thought seemed impossible. Politics in his district was controlled by established figures who had been in power for years. Zohan was young, unconnected, and had little money. But he believed that political power should belong to ordinary people, not just to those who could afford it. So, in 2019, he made a bold decision. He would run for the New York State Assembly, representing District 36 in Astoria, Queens. The announcement surprised many people. His opponent was a longtime incumbent with deep ties to the Democratic Party establishment. No one expected Zohan to have a chance. But instead of being discouraged, he saw an opportunity to awaken hope in his community. His campaign started small, a few volunteers, some donated flyers, and a powerful belief that politics should be about people, not power. He knocked on doors, introduced himself in multiple languages, and listened to the concerns of everyone he met. Many were surprised that a candidate cared enough to stop and truly listen. The campaign became a reflection of the neighborhood itself. Diverse, hardworking, and united by the dream of a fairer future. But the road was not easy. Critics called him unrealistic. Some dismissed him as just a socialist dreamer, and others tried to use his background against him. Being a Muslim, a child of immigrants, and a first-time candidate in a system that often favored the wealthy, he faced prejudice and doubt from many sides. Still, he refused to give up. He reminded his volunteers that every challenge was proof that their movement mattered. Then, just as the campaign was gaining momentum, the COVID-19 pandemic struck New York City. Streets went silent. People lost their jobs. Fear spread faster than the virus itself. Campaign events were canceled, and door-to-door outreach became dangerous. Zohan made a choice. Instead of pausing his work, he turned his campaign into a mutual aid network. He and his volunteers began delivering groceries, helping families apply for rent relief, and checking on neighbors who were isolated and afraid. The campaign that began as a political effort transformed into a lifeline for the community. This act of compassion changed everything. People began to see Zohan not just as a candidate, but as one of them, someone who truly cared. The movement grew stronger than ever. When Election Day arrived in 2020, the city was still struggling with the pandemic. Voting was slow, and the results took days to confirm. But when the final count came in, history was made. Zohan Mamdani had won. His victory was not just a political success. It was a symbol of what grassroots power can achieve. He had defeated an establishment-backed incumbent with the support of ordinary people. For the first time, his district was represented by a young, South Asian, Muslim man, someone who reflected the diversity and dreams of Queens itself. After the victory, Zohan addressed his supporters with humility. He said his win belonged to everyone who believed that politics should serve the people. He promised to fight for tenants' rights, for health care for all, for renewable energy, and for justice that reaches every corner of the city. But even after entering the assembly, his journey was not easy. He faced political resistance and criticism from those who preferred the old ways of doing things. Yet, he continued to speak truth to power, to represent working people, and to challenge injustice wherever he saw it. He remained rooted in his community. When he wasn't in Albany, working on legislation, he was back in Astoria, meeting families, visiting tenants' meetings, and supporting local events. He never wanted to be distant from the people who had elected him. Over time, his name became a symbol of hope, proof that even in a system built for the powerful, change is possible when courage and compassion lead the way. Zohan Mamdani's struggle to become a member of the New York State Assembly was not just a political story. It was the story of a man who believed that ordinary people deserve extraordinary representation. It was a story about standing up against odds, building a movement from the ground up, and serving with integrity. His journey reminds us that leadership is not about holding power, but about sharing it. And his struggle continues to inspire others, young people, immigrants, and dreamers, to believe that they too can make a difference, no matter where they come from.